From concept to reality with actionable data. On May 25th, 1961, President John F. Kennedy, in an address to the U.S. Congress, issued a challenge to the entire country when he said, "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth." Last July marked the 51st anniversary of the day America met that challenge, just 8 years after the president threw down the gauntlet. But this monumental feat could not have been accomplished without using data that was made actionable. Think about it. There were innumerable logistical issues to tackle. Things like timing the launch with the relative positions of Earth and Moon were optimal, choosing a landing site that met all the right conditions, supplying the needs of the astronauts, calculating fuel consumption parameters, figuring out how to get them there, and more importantly, bring them home safely. Well, the list just goes on and on and on. Remember, the microprocessor would not even be invented until 1971. So the technology needed to conquer all these insurmountable obstacles simply did not exist. I mean, it's not like they could Google anything because the internet hadn't been invented yet either. They just had to make it up as they went. All of this that you see on your screen here exponentially increased the value of having actionable data during the Apollo program to give NASA the insight they needed to answer the incessant questions, make those tough decisions, and ultimately meet JFK's challenge. Actually, they exceeded it, didn't they? Techipedia defines actionable insight as information that can be acted upon or information that gives enough insight into the future that the actions that should be taken become clear for decision makers. In other words, meaningful data that's useful for making a decision, answering a question, or solving a problem. Remember these three characteristics of actionable data because you will see them again. But in data storytelling, with every data visualization, you've got to start somewhere. You have a concept or an idea, and then you have as your end goal a completed visualization containing one or more graphs. Now, how do you get from concept to reality? I like to think of this data storytelling journey as a spectrum, along which I'm suggesting various stages, specifically 5, for best practices in getting from the idea on the left to the completed visualization on the right. Those 5 stages are conception, inception, perception, inspection, and direction. And the way I've listed these stages from left to right across the screen here, you might assume that my intent is for them to occur one after the other. Well, maybe so, but they can also be concurrent and sometimes overlapping. But in any case, we need to look at them in the light of a strategy that's comprehensive and with a positive mindset. See, this is supposed to be an enjoyable thing to do, not a drudgery. And don't forget, before your concept becomes a reality, it needs to be visualized and it must stand up to scrutiny. I'll give you more detail on that in just a few moments. Well, let's jump right in. First stage, conception. You have to start the race somewhere. Now, how do you go about doing that? Well, the key word here is articulate. Now, as you articulate the need, it's important to understand the audience. You know, those are the people that are going to be consuming your data. Visualization Senior Director Tricia Onderud recently said, your audience determines the depth of your data communication and the presentation method. You got to know your audience. That makes perfect sense to me. I mean, you wouldn't articulate the need to a room full of district managers in the same way you would to a group of retail store owners or DBAs or tech support staff or customers or anybody else. Speak to them at their level using terms that they can understand. You must also know your data. Now, that's a given because you need to articulate what you want to do with that data. And doing so is where your concept or idea is conceived. The most important thing to be articulated is the purpose for your data. That is, what are you trying to show? Are you showing comparison, distribution, composition, or relationship? See, the answer to that determines the type of visualization that'll be the most appropriate for the story you're telling with your data. And that leads to even more questions that guide you to refine your approach along the way. Think of it as a hierarchy. Dr. Andrew Abella, chairman of the Department of Business and Economics at the Catholic University in Washington, D.C., all around visualization expert, has come up with an amazing graphics tool that I believe masterfully articulates the need and sets the pace with these 4 categories that he's identified for data storytelling. Here's a look at Abella's chart chooser cheat sheet. You see the 4 categories radiating out from the center and the questions radiating out from that. So we'll take composition as an example and start asking questions. Does it change over time or is it static over time? If it changes over time, then, well, you got many periods or few periods. If there's many time periods, well, then are the differences relative or are they relative and absolute? You see how questions lead to other questions as you proceed along the decision tree, and that helps you to refine your approach and come up with the right graph. At least the ones that are considered to be best practice. All right, that's the stage of conception. Second stage, inception. Once the race has been started, here's where you need to make your case. Keyword, advocate. Make the case for expressing the concept visually. Folks, this is very powerful for a couple of reasons. According to Mike Parkinson, founder of Billion Dollar Graphics, we are affected in 2 ways. First of all, cognitively. Graphics speed up the way we communicate and help us to better understand and more clearly remember what we've learned. They're like visual clues that we can use to unlock a deeper meaning and focus our attention, so it's more likely we'll remember what we've seen. Secondly, we're also affected emotionally. Graphics also improve our mindset and affect our feelings. They connect with our creativity by stimulating different parts of the brain, leading us to more fully remember and understand what's being presented. So you realize what Parkinson's saying here. We're affected both cognitively and emotionally. In other words, graphics get a hold of both our brains and our hearts. Hey, what better marriage could you possibly want? I mean, anytime that you're able to touch both the brain and the heart, man, oh man, you have got something good going. British data journalist David McCandless said that sight by far has the highest bandwidth of any of the 5 senses. About 85% of the information we take in is by eye, he said. Additional research since then shows it's more like 90%. A couple of European research professors, Sawyer and Hogarth, teamed up on a study in which 3 groups of economists were asked the same question concerning a particular data set. Now, the results seem to support McCandless's TED Talk claim. The first group, they were given the data and a statistical analysis of the data. Remember, they only have one job now, answer one question. In spite of it, 72% of those economists could not get the answer right. A second group was given the data, the statistical analysis, and a graph. Now, if you guess that the second group did better than the first group, you'd be right, but not by much. 61% of those economists couldn't get it right. A third group was given only the graph, all right? No analysis, no data, no nothing, just the graph, and only 3% of them got the answer wrong. Hey, this certainly makes the case for visual representation of data, and it's certainly something that we can advocate. That's the stage of inception. Third stage, perception. Once you've started the race and you've made your case, it's time to motivate the base. Keyword, educate. Hey, we're not going to get very far in this data storytelling process if either the target audience or the stakeholders are not on board. So it's up to us to educate them, making them realize they've got some skin in this game. Listen, they can't take ownership or provide the necessary backing, financially or otherwise, if they don't understand what you're trying to present. or if they can't see what's in it for them, or if the visualization does not help them to make a decision, answer a question, or solve a problem. Say, I told you you'd see those three characteristics again. So how do I go about doing this? By understanding certain basic principles. I mean, that's foundational to any educational initiative. For instance, you ever heard anybody say, he's all talk but no action, or she's all beauty and no brains, or this project is just nothing but form without function? That begs the question, does form follow function? I'd have to say yes. I mean, it's the age-old argument, is it pretty or is it right? Does it look good or does it work? This leads us to another question. What do we mean by form and function? Function is what you do with the data. That's the brains. Whereas form is expressing functional outcomes in the best possible way. That's the beauty. You need both. Here's some best practices or cardinal rules that we need to keep in mind to ensure function gets the right priority over form in our data storytelling. Let me show you some examples of what not to do and how to deal with it. First of all, pie charts. You gotta love them or hate them. There's typically no middle ground with them. I mean, some people think they're the best thing since sliced bread, while others say they're the spawn of the devil himself. Hey, regardless of how you might feel about pie charts, it should be pretty easy to understand that pie charts are supposed to show the parts of a whole. Everybody ought to know that. You'd think. Some people just don't get it. I'll show you what I mean. Take a look at the pie chart shown in this fuzzy screenshot from a TV newscast. I see a couple of problems with this chart right off the bat. First of all, the numbers, they add up to 193%. How can you have 193% of a single pie, man? Secondly, check out the sizes of each slice. 70 is bigger than 60, isn't it? Well, then how come the 60 slice looks like it's bigger than the 70 slice? In reality, the survey questions used in putting the survey together allowed for multiple choices. That is, respondents were able to indicate support for more than one candidate. Aha. Now you see why the numbers add up to greater than 100. In and of itself, that's not necessarily a problem. But the problem is, that is not the way you show things in a pie chart. We can therefore pretty safely conclude that this pie chart is misleading. And in this particular case, a bar graph would have reflected the data much more accurately, right? Something like this. Same data, but presented in a way that is not misleading. So what about line graphs and bar charts? Well, another best practice is that the y-axis should have a consistent scale. Look at the sample line chart showing how the compound annual growth rate by year for some fictitious retail sectors has changed over time. Now, if on first glance, you might assume there's a huge spike between 2013 and 2014. But look more closely at the odd way in which the vertical axis is scaled. You see that? From 28 to 33%. Thus making the change between those 2 years appear to be fairly drastic. I'd call this chart misleading. By contrast, look at the chart on the right. See, it's the same data, but with the y-axis scaled to start from 0. You can see perhaps a more realistic depiction of the CAGR percent trend over that same 5-year period of time. I'd say the second chart is not misleading. And you notice I didn't call it corrected? See, many organizations purposefully will represent their graphics in a particular way without any regard at all for statistical accuracy. In fact, specific misrepresentation of data occurs in many cases for self-serving purposes. Personally, I'd rather hold myself to a higher standard of accuracy and integrity. Let the data speak for itself. Don't try to manipulate it. Now, that said, it doesn't necessarily mean that you must always force the y-axis to start at 0 in every single case, every single time. Sometimes when you're comparing multiple data sets with multiple series in which the numbers are pretty close together, the only way you can tell the difference is to zoom in on that scale. Whatever you do, all I'm saying is that you be consistent across the board and avoid making changes over time appear to be more drastic than they really are. Now, here's some other best practices that influence perception. If you're plotting something chronologically, it should go from the left, the past, to the right, the future, along the x-axis. If you're measuring quantity, plot it along the y-axis with the smaller numbers at the bottom and the bigger numbers at the top. And then be consistent when you're using colors, remembering that there are some universal constants. I mean, everybody knows this, like red means stop, danger, decline, whereas green means go, safety, growth. Of course, these days, we're encouraged to use a more muted palette for accessibility reasons, but the sentiment is still the same. And then keep your shaped graphical elements proportional to each other. Master statistician and Yale professor Edward Tufte advocated not exceeding what he used to call the live factor. Essentially, the representation of numbers as physically measured on the surface of the graphic itself should be directly proportional to the quantities they represent. As a mathematical equation, it's often expressed like this: the size of the effect shown in the graphic divided by the size of the effect shown in the data should never be greater than 1. Let me illustrate. In one of their iterative product releases for a new iPad model several years ago, Apple touted its greater battery capacity over its predecessor. Rightfully so. I mean, a 17% increase is pretty significant. But look at this chart, though. The battery icon on the right, representing the capacity of the new iPad, it looks like it's 3 or 4 times bigger than the one on the left, representing the predecessor. That's certainly way more than 17%. And as much as I like my iPad, that, my friends, is a misleading graph. And finally, always use the right tool for the right job. I mean, you wouldn't use a chainsaw to carve a turkey, would you? How about a sledgehammer to crack a walnut? Of course not. Don't be silly. The same principle applies with data visualizations. Okay, pie charts are great, unless you're one of those that think they're the spawn of the devil. Yeah, but if they're being used for the purpose for which they're intended, what they're designed for, they're great. But 2 of them side by side, not so much. Now, in all fairness, though, these 2 pie charts you see are 100% accurate. All right, there's nothing misleading or deceptive going on here. However, you've got to go back to the make the case, the inception stage, and ask yourself, what are you trying to show? Each chart by itself is trying to show how these 5 countries compare among themselves and to what extent they contribute to the whole. The 2 pie charts put together show how that overall makeup changed from one point in time on the left to the next point on the right. Now, for the sake of the argument, it doesn't matter what time frame is being compared in each pie, nor what the parts of the whole represent. Here's the problem. The human eye, together with the human brain, simply does not have the spatial acuity to perceive minute variances across multiple dimensions at the same time. Huh? Okay, to put it in simple terms, for those who would use a chainsaw to carve a turkey, it's kind of hard for us to see them differences in them slices when they're side by side like that. Precisely. So while the pie charts are accurate, they're not actionable. And why not? Well, because we're not able to do any of the 3 things that I talked about. Remember the 3 characteristics of actionable data? It should help you to make a decision, answer a question, or solve a problem. Okay? Why can't it do that? Because we can't tell just by looking at it. Did you hear what I just said? Isn't that the whole point of a visual? Is the visual? You can't even spell visualization without spelling visual, right? If you can't tell by looking at it, it's just plain flat out not actionable. Now, what if we were to express the same data as side-by-side bar graphs? Watch what happens. Boom. You can clearly see the trend they were trying to show. At the order of the countries, the ranking from 1 to 5 was completely reversed in the second time period. I remember earlier when we answered the question, does form follow function with a yes? Well, now we ask the question, does conclusion follow assumption? You know what? I'd have to say no, at least not always. See, that's because folks don't always see things the same way. Let's take a closer look. Here's a classic. Check it out. If we were in person, I might ask you to shout out, tell me what you see. You say, oh, I know. I see a young lady. Some of you might shout out and say, I know. I see an old lady. Well, I see a young lady. The young lady is facing away from the camera. Now you can see her little eyelash and her little nose, her chin, her jawline, her ear, her right ear, and she's wearing like a black necklace, okay? You see that? You know, I see an old lady. The old lady is facing towards the camera. Look at the same picture again on the right, okay? The old lady's left eye, here's the wart, the nose, the nostril. You see a big old wart on her nose. There's her mouth near the bottom and her pointy chin jutting off to the left. So, you know, some of you said old lady, some of you said young lady. Who's right? You know what? I got to say both, right? It's all a matter of perception. So you've started the race, you've made the case, and you've motivated the base. Now, give it some space. With the fourth stage of the spectrum by asking the question, does it stand up to scrutiny? This is inspection. Keyword, investigate. Hey, folks, being totally transparent helps you to avoid the pitfalls of bias and unethical use of your data upon inspection. And when you've done your due diligence, you're not going to cringe when you get these questions. You know the ones I'm talking about. Your favorite ones. Did you ensure data quality? Where'd you get your data? How do you know it's right? You won't be bothered by them. They won't intimidate you. Now, here's a trend that seems a little counterintuitive. The more complex your data model is, the less likely your people will be to embrace it. To that point, suppose you wanted to buy a blender for your grandmother, and the only choices you had are the ones on this slide. Now, which one do you think would be the better choice? Enough said. As you let the data behind your visualization stand up to inspection, it's important to be aware of the difference between impact and influence and how that plays into making data actionable. Impact is typically recognized as being an effect brought on by external factors that tend to push on your status quo. In a recent Harvard Business Review study, it was found that almost 85% of the company's performance depends upon outside factors. However, many of those same companies don't even have a clue about figuring out which of those outside forces are affecting their performance and how. Instead, those who make it a priority to identify these factors are pushed into acting upon them. That's impact. By contrast, influence is generally known to be the power to affect from internal forces that tend to pull on your status quo. See the difference? Impact is external, tends to push. Influence is internal, tends to pull. These are factors that your own organization can control. I'm talking about things like the way your data is organized and structured, when and how you're going to pull it into your data warehouse, and the general climate in your organizational culture. See, doing this is going to pull your strategy in the right direction from the inside. To put it bluntly, as I said near the beginning of the presentation, an idea must be visualized, then scrutinized before it can be realized. You can quote me on that. In other words, if you've given it some space and it can stand up to inspection, you are well on your way to making your concept a reality with actionable data. That said, I believe that we can measure success by capitalizing on this knowledge and turning ideas into reality, by blending impact with influence, leveraging both into a solid game plan to meet short term needs and provide long term benefit. And why is that? Well, because by this time, you will have learned to take your data, differentiate it to come up with information, see the connections to derive knowledge, determine the meaningful connections to grant insight, find the best paths between them for wisdom, and boom, at that point, you have impact and you will most certainly generate influence. So after having started the race, making a case, motivating the base, and giving it some space, we now finally come to the fifth and final stage of the spectrum, direction. It's time to put it into place. Keyword here, effectuate. I see this implementation cycle as a fourfold iterative process. You start off by deploying your solution using whatever organizational protocols and methodologies you've already got in place. And as your stakeholders start using the solution, they'll discover issues. Now, they may call them issues, they may call them defects, they may call them problems, but mark my words, they will discover issues. Then you analyze those issues and discern the right course of action to address them. Then you start deploying the remediation for those issues. And guess what? The cycle starts all over again. Deploy, discover, discern, and develop. And hopefully, you'll improve upon your solution with each iterative cycle. In conclusion, you asked me, can I truly turn my ideas into reality? You bet your boots you can. While developing your solution and moving it along these 5 stages of the spectrum, try to ensure best practices are followed. American mathematician John Tukey once said, "The greatest value of a picture is when it forces us to notice what we never expected to see." Let me ask you something. What value do you see in your data? And what ideas do you have when you see the data? To stimulate these ideas, remember, graphs and data visualizations are only as good as the data they portray. They should be no more complex than the data they portray, and they should never paint a distorted picture of the values they portray. Hey, don't forget Tufte's lie factor, and never let the size of the effect shown in the graphic be greater than the size of the effect shown in the data. All right, one last review. Here are the 5 stages of the spectrum one last time: conception, inception, perception, inspection, and direction. Enterprise account executive and storyteller Spencer Sobczak once said, "Data storytelling is both an art and a science. Our data visualizations are the most powerful when they find this balance." You now have the tools. So let's go balance art and science. Let's combine form and function. Let's blend beauty and brains. Hey, folks, I'm convinced that if you articulate, advocate, educate, and investigate your data, you should be able to effectuate a solution. Ladies and gentlemen, with actionable data, NASA exceeded President Kennedy's monumental challenge more than half a century ago, and not only sent astronauts to the moon successfully, but they also returned them to Earth safely. And what's more, they repeated it 5 more times over the next 3 years. You know, they definitely knew how to balance art and science, beauty and brains. But they couldn't have done it without actionable data. Remember, data is actionable only when it helps people do what 3 things? Do you remember them? Make a decision, answer a question, or solve a problem. Well, what can you do with actionable data? Well, you may not be putting a man on the moon, but you can certainly put the heat on your competition. If you have enough vision and drive, you can figure out how to get from today to tomorrow before it becomes yesterday and you're left behind holding the bag. Folks, turn your ideas into reality by making data actionable.